right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had good discussions in the breakout sessions. To do the report back, those of you who were chosen as the reporter from your group, please click on raise hand at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be able to bring you up on stage to do some report back. All right. So Amy, just ahead of Terry. Amy, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Kramer. I'm a PhD candidate from The Ohio State University. So I was representing, I believe, Table 2. So the first question, we talked about, how are some of the policies that we discussed this morning affecting, our work and our institutions? So I think the first thing that we talked about is a member at our table is from North Dakota and works with a lot of tribal universities, or tribal community colleges. So he spoke a lot about his experience of transitioning students from those communities into their university and some of the issues that they face with Indigenous students. We also had a couple folks who are in grad admissions, and so we had an interesting discussion of what does that mean in terms of like GRE scores. So should there be similar policies where you just remove the GRE, and how does that work particularly for international students where you might be dealing with very different metrics from different countries. And so then we also just talked about in general seeing how some of the inequities that occur within the K through 12 education system are kind of transitioned into our universities. I think through when you consider these SAT and ACT scores. So those are some of the things that we've started off talking about. And then we specifically got into some of the barriers that we see in trying to implement some more of the policies to kind of promote diversity. And I think one of the biggest things we talked about is just convincing faculty, getting them on board, and also just maybe removing some of the stigma of, we want to tell folks that our engineering students have this great high average ACT score. And so how do we remove that stigma? And what does that really mean? Does the ACT score actually, reflect success, reflect ability? And then we also talked about some of the issues working with community colleges, making sure that, how can we work with community colleges to make sure that they are preparing students to transition to our universities. And then finally, we had a nice discussion about how to overcome some of these barriers that we see. And I think the biggest thing came back to just like training and how can we work with our faculty again, to like overcome some of the stigma that there might be, to kind of get folks on board with these kind of alternative ways of admitting students, and having the data to kind of convince our faculty to get on board with some of these policies. So that was a big bulk of our conversation. So I will let the other group speak now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Terry.
So we were the rogue group over the far right, and so we decided that we may have changed the meeting. So I'm going to share with you our meetings just in case it's too far. But in topic 1, we decided that that those were actually the thorns in our side, and so we were trying to talk about what those thorns might be, and so our lists were many of the lists that Amy just talked about, and of trying to implement the test blind policy, convincing people that the test blind policy works, and then essentially overcoming old models and that just keep hanging on by like you just can just picture them just hanging on by their nails and they won't let go. And we're at a cicada time here, and it reminds me of a little cicada hanging onto the tree. So, but we talked about the implicit bias when reviewing, and we also talked about how to implement those things. So going to the next one is with implicit bias is a good example, because we think that not only does that happen, but we want to instigate training, but we want to instigate regular training of that shows more and more success and shows people data and essentially bust myths, because there's so many myths associated with engineering as a profession that people don't even realize the biases they have until you start using, like I love the NASM report on, messaging, or the NA report on changing the message. That still works today because so many people have so many biases about that. So doing those kinds of things are policies that we'd like to implement. And even with reviewers of like scholarships and things. So it wasn't just admissions, but it was kind of the next step too. And then other policies, we learned that other states have like the reverse transfer agreement policy, like Texas has, that helped facilitate the A&M academies. And it's a matter of how do we make those work. And so sometimes the policies are there, but the process to implement them are either ineffective because the wrong people have to implement them, or not happening at all. And then we went on to the barriers, and then we saw the barriers very much so typical and a lot like Amy, but we had the list of from the institution to the staff, the faculty, the students, even some of the students themselves, and that in specific faculty, like our advisors, sometimes we have to myth bust with our advisors, and we have to myth bust with maybe not all admissions people. Like we may have a great champion on our side, but the rest of the admissions office, we may need to work with, just this information kind of myth busting again. And so those are our barriers. We kind of talked about which ones would impact what and how to make it a win-win-win kind of situation, starting with the students. How do we create the win, starting with the students, with the institution? If it's a 2-year institution, who's that with? And then overcoming the barriers. We talked about myth busting, data modeling to show the efficacy, showing that we have safe and inclusive spaces for students, and then intentional programming that created identity and belongingness, and the things that we know lead to success of our students.
Great, thank you, Terry. Adrian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adrian Parks, and I am representing the University of North Texas. What we talked about in our group, I made a little list. Sorry, so if you see me looking off, I'm looking at my list. So what we talked about was just improving holistic approaches for admissions and potentially using test blinds or test optional strategies for admissions for the FTIC students. And then also we talked about what it looks like to creating the community college pipeline to the university in this sense of what Dr. D'Souza was talking about at Texas A&M. And I was just explaining like what we do at North Texas. And we have, transfer articulation agreements, but I was like, those don't always work. Like we can give them to students, but sometimes they don't use them like they're supposed to. And so just figuring out ways to reduce the amount of unneeded credits that students are taking so they're really transferring 2 years and then they only have 2 years remaining once they transfer to universities. And so then some of the issues that, of course, we found that we talked about was different legislation policies. One of the individuals in our group was from CU, and they were saying how it is required of their legislation that they have to have testing scores. And so what does that look like to change that, to advocate for changes? So we talked about that. We also talked about, like y'all both said, faculty feeling like, oh, are we not going to have it in like the rigor that we need for our college? And so just dispelling that myth. And then some of the things that we talked about that could help negate all of these barriers would be education and data points. And then also one of the individuals just brought up a really good point about ABET. Just using ABET policy to combat these myths, using what ABET says about culture inclusivity, and just building that type of thing in order to work against some of the myths and the things that people think about when it comes to potentially removing testing standards. And so those are some of the things that we discussed in our table.
Thank you, Adrian. And Michael.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Brown from Rutgers School of Engineering. Had an opportunity to chat a little bit with my table about the admissions practices and some of the things that are happening. I was actually at the table with a small table with Tom Ferris, who's from my institution. So we got to talk a little more deeply about some of the things that are happening at our institution and how we could actually roll things out and give some feedback. And actually reflect on some of the things that are happening currently at our institution as well. We were able to have some test optional admissions practices this year as a result of the pandemic and COVID-19, but it's something that everyone wholeheartedly supported before going into the pandemic, but they didn't really to roll that out. So now with this opportunity here and folks able to see the impact and the impact to diversity, particularly when we talk about our schools and our smaller programs that are occurring on campus, it gives more leverage to kind of give the faculty, the staff, and all the players that are involved in admissions more reason to move forward with test optional and hopefully moving even more forward to test blind, if we can see that these are not the biggest predictors of the success of our students within our institution. So that was a lot of what we spoke about. And we also moved the conversation into talking more about how it could actually roll out. Not as practically, what does it look like if we go test optional 100% for all of our students, or test blind for all of our students as well, because we know everything comes down to dollars and cents and bodies and support. And what does it look like at our institution to roll this out so that we have every application that is being reviewed holistically? We know it comes down to dollars and bodies and cents, but maybe we need to start looking more at artificial intelligence, AI, and how we can automate, this process, who we can work with to see what these applications or application review actually looks like to process this stuff. We know it's being done in other areas. Is it being done in admissions? Possibly not. But maybe there is institutions or areas where this is being done that we can use as a model to roll out at our institution as well. So really trying to figure out, what are those practices that we need to now figure out how to take things even further when we talk about holistic review, being test optional, and making sure that we have that impact on diversity and students that wouldn't have typically have had access to our engineering program moving forward.
All right, great, thank you. And just a reminder to everyone watching that if you have a question for one of our reporters here, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. I will say thank you for tuning up. On Wednesday, we are going to have a panel on AI tools in recruiting, admissions, and enrollment management. And we also are having a panel tomorrow on transfer and 3+2 programs, so we'll be discussing more about that. I guess maybe I don't see any questions coming in. Do any of you have questions for each other after hearing? Obviously, you all had sort of similar conversations, not terribly surprisingly, but I think if there are questions that you have for each other, go ahead. And if not, that's fine too. So I think thank you all for being the reporters and for great discussions in the breakout sessions. As a reminder, I guess we can end a little bit early today, get a few minutes back on our day. Everyone is usually okay with that after our Zoom meetings and being on camera. But just a reminder to everyone to post feedback on the whiteboards in the lobby. We're using that to sort of move our conversations forward. And we will have the networking will remain open until 5 o'clock Eastern. If people want to sit and chat with each other or ask questions, and we will all be in there. And otherwise, we will see you tomorrow morning at 11 Eastern, 8 Pacific. Thank you.